Picture two scenes, separated by 3,000 miles and everything else that distance implies. The first is in southern Iran, 1951. The city of Abadan, on a flat and sweltering island where the Shat al-Arab meets the Persian Gulf. The temperature is 40 degrees and climbing. The air smells of crude oil and sulfur. Workers live in cramped settlements of mud and corrugated metal, while, a short distance away, the British managers of the Anglo-Iranian oil company inhabit a separate world. Air-conditioned offices, a private golf course, a swimming pool, a club where Iranians are not permitted to enter. The oil refinery looming behind all of this is the largest in the world. Black blood pumping through its pipes, 24 hours a day, in quantities that make it one of the most valuable industrial assets on the face of the earth. The second scene is in London. Gray drizzle over manicured lawns. A country that has just won the greatest war in history and is discovering, in the months and years that follow victory, that it cannot pay for what winning cost. Rationing is still in effect. The debt is enormous. The empire that once spanned a quarter of the earth is contracting under the pressure of independence movements it no longer has the financial capacity to suppress. The pound sterling, which was the reserve currency of the world for a century, is under permanent pressure from the dollar. Britain is, in the language of finance, a bankrupt victor. It has the honors and none of the money. The connection between those two scenes is a pipeline. The oil flowing from Abadan is not merely valuable. It is, in the most literal sense, the financial lung that allows a shrinking empire to keep breathing. Britain's share of the revenues from the Anglo-Iranian oil company funds the balance of payments that keeps the pound from collapsing. Without Iranian oil, the Treasury's calculations point to consequences that the officials doing the calculating describe in private as catastrophic. Lose Abadan, and Britain's standard of living falls to levels not seen since before the Industrial Revolution. The oil is not a commercial asset, it is life support. Mohammad Mossadegh understood the political mathematics of this dependency with remarkable precision. He was 70 years old in 1951, physically frail, given to theatrical demonstrations of emotion that his enemies read as instability and his supporters understood as a deliberate performance of passionate conviction. He was from the Iranian aristocracy. He had been educated in Europe, had practiced law in Switzerland, had spent decades in Iranian politics watching the country he loved be managed as a resource extraction zone for foreign powers. His central argument was simple, and it was unanswerable. Iran sat on enormous reserves of oil. That oil had been extracted for decades, under an agreement that gave Iran a royalty of roughly 16% of profits, while the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, owned predominantly by the British government, retained the rest. The same company was paying more in taxes to the British Treasury than it was paying in total to the Iranian government, whose oil it was extracting. Iranian workers in the oil industry were paid wages that bore no relationship to the value of what they were producing. Iranian engineers were excluded from senior technical positions, regardless of their qualifications. The company operated in Iran as a colonial institution, with all of the assumptions about the relative worth of Iranian and British lives that the word colonial implies. Mossadegh's position was not extremism. It was the straightforward application of a principle that the post-war international order was in the process of enshrining as universal, that a country has the right to determine what happens to its own natural resources. The oil, he argued, was a gift from God to the Iranian people, not a dividend for British shareholders. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In May, Mossadegh became prime minister. The British installations at Abadan were placed under Iranian state control. The largest oil refinery in the world was, for the first time, Iranian. In London, the reaction to the nationalization combined genuine strategic alarm with something more personal and less rational. Winston Churchill, who had returned to power in October 1951, had a particular relationship with Anglo-Iranian oil. It had been Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty before the First World War, who had arranged the British government's purchase of a controlling stake in the company, converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil and binding British strategic power to Iranian petroleum. The company was, in a real sense, his creation. The loss of Abadan was not merely a financial crisis. It was a personal insult from a man Churchill regarded as a theatrical troublemaker who did not understand the realities of the world he was disrupting. Britain's initial response was the response of a power that had not yet fully absorbed the implications of its post-war financial position. Plans were developed for a military operation to retake the refinery by force. The legal pretexts were prepared. The forces were put on standby. And then the calculations were done, and the calculations were devastating. Britain could not afford a war. Not in the financial sense. Not in the political sense, with the United States that had made clear it would not support a military adventure in Iran. And not in the practical sense, because the Iranian people's support for nationalization was broad enough and deep enough that a military operation would almost certainly produce a guerrilla conflict that the post-war British Army had neither the capacity nor the resources to sustain. So Britain chose a different weapon. It launched an economic war. It blockaded Iranian oil exports, using its control of tanker fleets and its dominance of the international oil distribution system to ensure that no country that wanted continued access to British-controlled shipping and oil infrastructure could buy Iranian petroleum. It withdrew its technical staff from Abadan, correctly calculating that the Iranians would struggle to operate the complex refinery systems without the expertise the British had deliberately withheld from Iranian engineers. It froze Iranian assets in British banks. It applied diplomatic pressure across every channel available to it. And it waited for the Iranian economy to buckle under the weight of a boycott that was cutting off the revenues that the Iranian state depended on. If nobody has explained to you that the British campaign against Mossadegh was not primarily a response to communism, but an economic war fought by a bankrupt empire to protect its financial life support machine, subscribe now. The story of Abadan is the story of how desperation produces decisions whose consequences outlast the desperation by generations. Stay with us. The economic war was working. By 1952, Iranian oil revenues had collapsed. The government was under severe fiscal pressure. Mossadegh was navigating a domestic political landscape that was becoming more fractious as the economic pain spread. But working slowly was not the same as working quickly enough for a British government facing its own escalating financial pressure. The blockade was hurting Iran. It was also costing Britain. The refinery was sitting idle. The oil was not flowing. And the pound sterling was feeling the consequences of the disruption to the supply that had been underpinning its stability. The solution that the British government eventually arrived at was to change the framing. Britain could not persuade the United States to support an operation aimed at recovering oil revenues for a British company. The Truman administration was unsympathetic to what it read as old-fashioned colonial resource extraction. But a different story was available, and it was not entirely false. The Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh, was a real political force. Soviet influence in Iran was a genuine strategic concern. If Mossadegh's government collapsed under the pressure of the economic war, or if he sought Soviet support to survive it, the consequences for Western strategic interests in the Middle East could be severe. Britain manipulated American paranoia about Soviet expansion with considerable skill. The narrative presented to the Eisenhower administration, which took office in January 1953 with a more aggressive posture toward communism than its predecessor, was reframed. This was no longer about oil profits. This was about the domino effect. This was about whether Iran would fall behind the Iron Curtain, whether the Soviet Union would gain access to the Persian Gulf, whether the entire strategic architecture of the Middle East would shift in ways that threatened not just British interests, but the entire Western position. The CIA, under Allen Dulles, was receptive to this framing in ways that the Truman State Department had not been. Operation Ajax was the result. The CIA and MI6 worked together to design and execute the removal of Mossadegh from power. The operation was, by the standards of covert action, relatively simple in its mechanics and extraordinary in what it revealed about how modern power actually operates. The CIA's contribution to the coup has been estimated at roughly $1 million. With that money, it purchased a revolution. Or rather, it purchased the appearance of a revolution. The mobs that filled the streets of Tehran on August 19, 1953 were not a spontaneous popular uprising. They were organized. The generals who withdrew their support from Mossadegh had been approached and had reached their own calculations about where their interests lay. The clerics who provided religious cover for the action had been cultivated. The gangsters who provided the muscle for the street demonstrations had been paid. The coup succeeded in a single day of theatrical chaos. Mossadegh was arrested in his pajamas. He was tried, convicted of treason and sentenced to 3 years in prison, after which he was kept under house arrest until his death in 1967. The Shah, who had fled to Rome as the operation began, was returned to his throne. Anglo-Iranian oil resumed flowing. The new arrangement that was negotiated gave Britain a somewhat reduced share of Iranian oil revenue, with American companies brought in as additional partners, but the fundamental structure was restored. Abadan was back under Western control. The life support machine was reconnected. In the short term, the coup accomplished everything Britain needed it to accomplish. The oil revenues resumed. The pound stabilized. The immediate financial crisis that the loss of Abadan had threatened was averted. Churchill, who had driven the operation with a tenacity that reflected how personally he had taken the original insult, could claim a victory. The man who had disrupted the empire's financial life support was under arrest. The order that had sustained British prosperity was restored. What could not be seen in August 1953 was what had been purchased along with the oil. What had been purchased was a 50-year nightmare. The Shah returned to his throne with the knowledge that he owed his position to foreign intelligence agencies rather than to the loyalty of his own people. He ruled accordingly, with increasing authoritarianism, sustained by Western support and Western oil revenue, governing a country in which the memory of what had been done to Mossadegh was not fading but accumulating. The coup did not extinguish Iranian nationalism. It gave Iranian nationalism its most powerful argument, that the country's democratic experiment had been ended not by its own failures, but by foreign intervention. in the service of foreign financial interests through the corruption of Iranian institutions that the foreign powers had purchased with $1 million. The man who would eventually inherit the consequences of this argument was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The 1979 Islamic Revolution that swept away the Shah and replaced him with an Islamic Republic was not simply a religious event. It was the political crystallization of 26 years of accumulated anger about 1953. When Khomeini's followers stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 diplomats hostage, they were not acting irrationally from within their own historical framework. They were acting on a reading of recent history in which the United States had demonstrated in 1953 that it was willing to destroy Iranian democracy to protect its own interests. The hostage crisis of 1979 was the interest payment on a debt incurred in August 1953. The coup was a tactical success and a strategic catastrophe. Britain saved its balance sheet for a decade. It lost something more important and less recoverable. The moral authority that Britain had claimed as the country that stood alone against fascism, that had sacrificed its financial future for democratic values, that had earned through suffering the right to speak about freedom and sovereignty, that authority was spent in the streets of Tehran in August 1953. The hand that feeds you today, Mossadegh had understood, might strangle you tomorrow. He was right about the hand. He had simply not understood how many hands there were and how much they were willing to pay. Britain's oil revenues from Iran continued to flow through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. The financial pressure that had made the operation feel necessary was relieved. The empire continued its managed retreat from formal colonialism, shedding territories in Africa and Asia with greater or lesser grace, negotiating the transitions with varying degrees of success. The special relationship with the United States deepened. The pound remained under pressure. The process of relative economic decline that the Second World War had accelerated continued on its trajectory, neither stopped nor started by the events at Abadan. What the coup left behind in Iran was a political wound that did not close. The two communists that Britain and America had cited as the justification for the operation were a real but limited force. The nationalism that Mossadegh represented was not limited at all. It was the mainstream. It was what most Iranians believed about the right of their country to control its own resources and make its own decisions. By suppressing it through covert action, Britain and America did not eliminate it. They drove it underground, where it combined with religious conviction and historical grievance to produce something considerably more dangerous than a liberal Democrat in pajamas. The revolution of 1979 established a form of government in Iran that has defined the country's relationship with the West for the 4 decades since. The hostility between Iran and the United States and Britain that has shaped Middle Eastern geopolitics, that has contributed to multiple regional conflicts, that has driven the development of Iranian nuclear ambitions, that has produced decades of sanctions and proxy conflicts and dangerous miscalculations. The roots of all of this run through a single week in August 1953, when $1 million purchased the end of Iranian democracy. An economy without oil, Churchill had feared, meant Britain without a future. He was right about that. What he could not see from inside his 19th century framework of power and empire and the natural order of nations was that an oil policy without justice meant Iran without a future, and that Iran without a future would eventually become a problem that outlasted every financial calculation that had justified the coup. The last gasp of empire did not kill the empire. It simply delayed the accounting while making the final bill considerably larger. Mossadegh died in 1967, still under house arrest, never pardoned. He is remembered in Iran as a martyr, the man who tried to give Iranians control of what was theirs and was stopped by foreign powers who could not afford to let him succeed. The refinery at Abadan still operates. The oil still flows. The question of who benefits from it, and on whose terms, and through what structures of power and accountability, is still contested. The 50-year nightmare that followed the coup of 1953 has not ended. It has changed its form. History is not over. It is underwritten.